Ladies and gentlemen, we have distinguished guests today, two senators from the United States in Wroclaw, but on the way to Kiev. That's important for the inauguration of the new president. Senator John McCain from Arizona, welcome. Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, welcome. Both senators are from the Foreign Relations Committee of the United States Senate. Difficult times, but also hopeful times. It's the 6th of June, 2014, the 17th anniversary of the invasion of Normandy. I would call it the, not only I, but let's call it the founding act of the Western Alliance. And we have had a tremendous and terrific week in Poland. We had President of the United States declaring reassurance of Poland and for our allies and neighbors like Baltic states in times of a major international crisis. We have felt a little bit insecure in recent months and in recent years because we thought that the United States is abandoning us, Central Europeans. And on the very anniversary of the 25 years of the collapse of communism, we welcome that reassurance. But also we look forward and we ask, will that promise that the President has given us this week hold? Will it stay? Will the United States really reassure us? Because also some days ago we have heard a major speech by the United States President Barack Obama saying that the United States is the indispensable power, but it is also a power that does not want to be involved everywhere with all its mighty power. Senator McCain.
Well, I agree with you. This is a time for us to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Normandy invasion, probably one of the most glorious chapters in the history, not only of the United States, but all of our allies, the major step in freeing Europe from the yoke of Hitler's fascism, and also an anniversary of freedom and independence of the Polish people. So I think we have a lot to look back on with pride. I think we can look back on the NATO alliance as probably the most effective and important alliance in modern history. That actually was because of the NATO alliance. I think you could give it great credit for the ending of the then Soviet Union and freeing the captive nations. So I think we have a history to look back on, and maybe one of the lessons we should learn is that it was an alliance that really has not only won the Cold War, but afterwards, with the inclusion of former Iron Curtain countries, has made NATO a much stronger alliance. And we see, for example, Bosnia, NATO operation, Kosovo, Libya, that NATO remains vital. Now, there are questions about it, and I hope we'll get into it, because many of our members do not put enough money into defense. I mean, it's just a fact. Except for Poland, what are the other two? There's two other countries.
Estonia.
Yeah, there's only three countries now, Canada and the United States, that meet the 2% threshold for spending on defense. And I would argue with you, we live in an incredibly dangerous world, in some ways more dangerous than it was in the Cold War. Not in all ways, but in some ways. So it's time we, I believe, understood Vladimir Putin. I think we need to understand this is a KGB colonel that said that the worst event of the 20th century was the breakup of the Soviet Union. I think we ought to understand what his ambitions are to restore the Russian Empire. And I think we need to understand that the only way he will probably cease his encroachment in one way or another is that if he sees that the cost is higher than the benefit. So we live in interesting times, and I believe that our solidarity with Poland and the countries that are in this part of the world is probably of the utmost importance. Murphy and I have discussed a number of things and with our friends and allies and among ourselves, including joint exercises that are done on a permanent basis here. Not the old traditional military base where we had a school and a hospital and all that, but a joint operating base such as we have in Australia today and signed with the Philippines at military assistance plans, a number of other ways that we can strengthen our solidarity. And remember that NATO is a defensive alliance, but we can strengthen our capabilities through cooperation, greater cooperation, and work with and planning with our allies. I could go on a lot further, but this is a very interesting time. Let me just finally say, I don't know what Vladimir Putin is going to do. I did predict that he would go to Crimea because of his feeling of necessity to get Sevastopol after Yanukovych fell. I think it's clear he's still fomenting unrest and problems in eastern Ukraine. I don't know what he's going to do in the future because I'm not sure what his calculations are. But the problem in Ukraine is a long, long way from solved. And I believe that we need to together plan ways to prevent or dissuade Vladimir Putin from further adventurism in Ukraine and in the entire region. And that isn't just Ukraine. He's putting pressure on the Baltics. He's putting pressure on Moldova. He's putting pressure on Romania. And I think that the best thing for us to do is to increase our solidarity and our work together and prepare our capabilities. That's the way we won the Cold War, and I think that's the way to approach it now.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Murphy, it sounds optimistic what Senator McCain says, what the President has said, but that promise is conditional as far as I understand it. The United States Congress must agree to that. It's additional $1 billion. We have seen here in Poland and here in Europe the budget debates in US Congress and the ping pong between the government of America and Congress. Would the Congress agree, and would the American public agree to further to additional commitment of the United States in Central Europe?
Well, first of all, let me thank the Forum and Atlanta Council for having me here today, especially as a Polish-American. I have this very Irish last name, but more Polish blood in me than I do Irish blood, as it turns out. It's wonderful to be back home. I'm also thrilled to be here with Senator McCain. This is our fourth trip to Europe in the last 6 months, and I heard someone describe him earlier today as an icon of the transatlantic relationship, and that is absolutely true. But I think the fact that we are here today hopefully demonstrates that there is, I would argue, a growing level of bipartisan support for reinvesting in this relationship. Just to give you a little bit of context, I came to Congress in 2007 at the arguable height of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. And if you were a new member of Congress at that time, the little portion of your brain that you had to focus on foreign affairs, you had to spend thinking about those two wars and then a little bit about the Middle East, and there just had been years and years of neglect in terms of Congress developing expertise beyond the icons in the Senate and the House who had spent a lifetime working on this relationship. And so in this crisis is an opportunity for Congress to relearn the importance of one of the most lasting, one of the most important alliances in the history of the globe. And I think you will see support for the President's proposal or a version of the President's proposal. And I hope it'll be beyond just a year. I hope that there will be a lasting commitment, because I agree with Senator McCain. If Putin does not pay a price, and I think it's arguable right now whether the United States and Europe are going to join together to force Putin to pay a price, this might not be the end of his provocations. And he doesn't have to invade countries with armies anymore because he has developed a new form of warfare with subtle provocations and gradual intimidation and bribery that start to exert control over a country without necessarily causing a tripwire on Article 5 protections. And so we've got a complicated world and a complicated region. The good news, echoing Senator McCain's optimism, is that I think you've got a Congress, at least a Senate, that stands behind this relationship.
You have mentioned, Senator Murphy, that Putin should pay the price. What do you mean, price? What does this word mean? Today, President Putin has met with Western leaders. Yesterday, he met with Western leaders, and we in Poland at least think that this price is limited, that the price he's paying is not that high.
Well, I think you have to think about the short term and the long term. We say that the price is limited today because he seems to have these robust approval ratings, despite the fact that his economy is likely in recession already, billions of dollars fleeing the country and capital. A major U.S. bank was in my office 2 weeks ago saying that they have a new internal policy that anything with the word Russia on it now can't be touched with a 10-foot pole with respect to new investments. But I think this burst of nationalism will fade. And if we continue to move forward with sanctions, I don't think that what we have on the table today should be the end. Ultimately, the Russian people are not going to put up with a declining economy partnered together with a contraction of political rights that you've seen over the last 20 years. So I think that there is still a message that can be sent. And of course, this is also about broadcasting a message to other countries like China that might be thinking about using military force to change their borders. They need to see that there is an economic price to be paid as well. I'm not saying that changes his disposition in Crimea, but it sends a message to the other part of the world and perhaps changes his disposition with respect to future provocations.
Senator McCain, do you agree that this burst of nationalism and chauvinism in Russia, and not only in the Kremlin but also in the society, will fade finally, will evaporate?
Well, first of all, could I say that we have a well-known reputation in Congress for hating each other and gridlock. Senator Murphy and I and Senator Johnson of Wisconsin have spent a lot of time together, and we don't always agree on everything, but we work together very closely because we feel we have an obligation to work at this time of great crisis in the Crimea and, frankly, in other areas as well, because I said this isn't just the Crimea or Ukraine. We visited the Baltics. They've felt enormous pressure there. Moldova because of Transnistria, and of course Romania. Any place with Russian-speaking citizens falls prey to Mr. Putin's warped view of that they deserve somehow Russian intervention. I'll be very frank. I've been very disappointed in the reaction to Vladimir Putin annexing Crimea, which Russia had signed an agreement in Budapest when Ukraine turned over its nuclear arsenal. And that agreement stated unequivocally that the territorial integrity of Ukraine, including Crimea, would be respected. Vladimir Putin blatantly violated that. I think that he continues to foment unrest in eastern Ukraine and causing deaths and hardship to people. And as I said, I'm not sure what more that he will do. I think it again depends on his calculations. I was very disturbed when there was a lot of threats that were made by both the United States and our European friends about sanctions and punishments. When you really look at what the price that Vladimir Putin has paid, I think any objective observer would say that it's been minimal. That's an argument, in my view, for energy independence for Europe, particularly Ukraine. We all know the dependency that our Europeans have on Russian energy. we've been discussing amongst us and, and with leaders in our energy sector a way that we could take that natural gas that's being flared, being burned, $3 million a day worth in Fargo, North Dakota, and somehow end up in the living room of a family in Kiev so that they're not dependent on Russian energy. As long as they are, I'm afraid that we're not going to see very much of a stringent reaction in the form of sanctions. But I do believe, and I'm also extremely disappointed that time after time this administration has refused the urgent and fervent pleas for weapons with which to defend themselves. So, I hope that that's changed. Now, today, the President of the United States gave a speech rather specific and rather encouraging that we're going to take certain steps, we're going to provide certain assistance, we're going a pretty detailed plan on some of the actions that the United States, with our allies, will take. I hope that that is implemented, and frankly, I'll take their word for it, that they will implement it. But I think we have to really appreciate the fact that Vladimir Putin right now is sitting pretty well. I'd just like to finally say, I agree very much with Senator Murphy. Vladimir Putin is running a country that is really a gas station masquerading as a country. Actually, it's a mafia-run gas station masquerading as a country. And the long-term prospects of Russia are dim almost by any parameter, whether you look at age, whether you look at demographics, whether you look at alcoholism, if you look at environment, if you looked at the whole kleptocracy on which the country is based, the long-term prospects for Russia by any objective observer are, I think, very poor. And the last thing they want is a thriving democracy in Ukraine right next door. But in the short term, as Chris pointed out, his popularity is up. He's feeling his oats. He now is met at the G7 with every Western leader, with the exception of President Obama. And so I think he's feeling his oats, and I think he has to understand that sooner or later there are consequences for what he has done.
Senator Murphy, Senator McCain has mentioned the arms shipments to Ukraine as a possibility, as I understand. This would be a dramatic change in U.S. policy towards Ukraine and towards Moscow. Would you agree to a necessity to send arms, lethal equipment, as you call it in American English?
Well, I certainly agree that the United States has to have a commitment to helping Ukraine rebuild its military. And I think it's just the distinction between what the short-term capability of the Ukrainian military is versus their long-term capability and necessity. I have not, frankly, thought that it was wise to provide lethal assistance with the potential threat of Russian invasion, not because I thought it would be provocative, but because I have worried about what the message would be sent if the Russians were to march in and beat a Ukrainian military armed with U.S. weapons that didn't fundamentally make a difference. But Senator McCain and I are not that far apart in the sense that there is a desperate need to rearm the Ukrainians now that it's pretty apparent that they're fighting an insurgency rather than an invading Russian army. I think that perhaps reopens the conversation in Congress for more immediate defensive weaponry. But clearly we have to have a long-term commitment as well. And again, I would just underscore back to Senator McCain's earlier point, this really is an exercise of Russian panic in the sense that just compare where they were 6 months ago to where they are today. 6 months ago, they had a Russian president virtually under their thumb. They had an economy that was technically not in recession. They were a member of the G8. Today, their economy is in trouble, whether that's been reflected in his poll ratings or not. Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova have all signed some form of agreement with the European Union, moving towards the west rather than to the east. And for the time being, Russia is no longer a member of the G8. I agree. We still have a long way to go to deliver that message to him. But this is an uncomfortable position for Putin, and we just have to make sure that we continue to ratchet up that pressure.
Senators, let me ask you both, how did it happen? There was a policy of the US government called reset, whatever we call it today, whether it was a failure or not. It was a kind of a doctrine. And was it the reset that caused this crisis, or some other forces that caused it? Senator McCain.
Well, I am of the view that President Obama, with some justification, came to power to not be Bush, not Bush, and with a desire to, quote, reset not only with Russia, but with Iran, to a wholly different approach to the conduct of national security policy. Now, part of that, I think, at least to some degree, was understandable because the American people had been involved in 2 wars. We had thousands of Americans who had lost their lives in combat, and they were, to say the least, Americans were war-weary. But I think that it was a naive approach to Vladimir Putin in that the reset button obviously has been a failure, and the overheard conversation between him and the president and Medvedev saying, tell Vladimir I'll be more flexible, obviously, in my view, indicated a misreading of Vladimir Putin and what he's all about. As I just mentioned, Vladimir Putin is an old KGB colonel that is interested and committed to doing what he can to restore the old Russian Empire. And I think we needed to treat him as such. That doesn't mean you don't talk to him. Reagan, every president we've had, talked to Russian leaders. It doesn't mean that you don't negotiate with them. But it does mean you approach him for what he is and have no illusions as to what his ambitions are. And that way, a much more realistic approach to Vladimir Putin, in my view, would be much more successful.
One more question to you, Senator McCain. I have read, in the past 2 years, I have read memoirs of George W. Bush, Condoleezza Rice, and very recently, Robert Gates. And at least in these first 2 books, relations between America and Russia under George Bush administration were very close. And were there any failures on the Republican side, on the Republican administration side, that might have led in some way to today's situation?
I think that that's a fair statement. As you know, President George W. Bush, who I happen to admire and like personally, once said that he looked into Putin's eyes and he saw
in
his
Slovenia,
soul.
I think.
When I was running for president, I said I looked into his eyes and saw 3 letters, a K, a G, and a B. So I have to say, this is kind of a disease that seems to affect world leaders. And we see this in the Yalta agreements. We've seen it with conservative and liberal Republican and Democrat presidents, that if you have a close enough personal relationship, then things will be much better. I think it's good to have a good personal relationship, but I think you've got to understand that that leader is going to act in what that leader thinks is in the interest of his nation. Famous quote in history, Roosevelt, I think it was, we like Uncle Joe and we want him to like us, so we should give him whatever he wants. Something along those lines about Stalin. So it is a disease that I think Churchill had the same problem, as much as I admire Winston Churchill. So I think that, frankly, there was not an appreciation as much for Vladimir Putin as perhaps we we should have had, even under the Bush administration.
Since the end of the Cold War, there's always been a belief among some that there was an inevitability to Russia eventually becoming part of
Like us.
Europe and becoming part of the West. And I think we can safely say that at the very least, under Vladimir Putin, that is not going to be an inevitable future. Much of his foreign policy, for his own reasons perhaps, for internal political reasons, are centered around perpetually poking the United States and other Western allies in the eye with a stick. But I would answer your question very simply. No, I don't think the reset is the reason for the crisis in Ukraine, and evidence of that is that, in 2008, Putin was trying some of the same tactics with, arguably more ferocity in Georgia. He has, as Senator McCain has pointed out, long had a belief that it's his destiny to reestablish control of what he calls the near abroad, and that existed before the reset and existed after the reset. And again, it is important to just go into this relationship with eyes wide open without misunderstanding that there are places where we can work together. I mean, it's somewhat remarkable that during this period of immense strife between our two nations that we still have been able to work with a modicum level of cooperation on Syria or Iran. And so it just speaks to the, I think, perpetual complexity of this relationship. I think it's going to be more bad than good, but there are still going to be places where we're going to have to work together.
Could I just mention, it's in passing, I'm the only person you'll probably ever talk to that has been censored by the Arizona Republican Party for not being a good enough conservative and sanctioned by Vladimir Putin. So it's a very...
Listen, I actually, the day that the sanctions were coming out, I sent out a statement advising the Russians that if they really wanted to punish John McCain, they wouldn't put him on the list. That would make him angry.
Okay. Short questions to you both, senators, and then we go to further issues apart from Russia and Ukraine. The opposite of reset is containment, or not? What is the opposite of reset?
Again, I don't think it's a binary world. Whether or not you think the reset worked in totality, there were pieces of the reset that did work. For instance, a new arms control agreement, more coordination on anti-terrorism activities, an ability to coordinate with Russia on activities in Afghanistan. There are plenty of pieces of the reset that didn't work. But again, I don't think this is a world in which we decide that all of our policies are designed to contain Russia and we work with our allies around them, or that we engage on every single issue. I ultimately think we're going to have to make choices, places where we cannot work with them on Crimea and their actions in Ukraine, places where we will have to continue to work with them.
I don't think it's, I do not believe this will return to the, quote, Cold War. That just too many things are different, and somehow say that we're back to that is just, it's dangerous. It's very, very bad in my view, but to say it's just a return to the Cold War.
And it's costly.
But let me point out that I think one of the ways that we could have an effect is if we really help the resistance in Syria. Despite the fact that the Russians cooperated on the removal of the chemical weapons, which, by the way, are not out, and they're using chlorine gas now, we have had significant evidence of. There's Russian airplanes landing every day at the Damascus airport with arms and weapons, including these horrible barrel bombs that are big cylinders filled with explosives and shrapnel that they're dropping on innocent men, women, and children. If we really wanted to do something important, to me, it would be to give the resistance a lot more weapons, to give them anti-air weapons, to take out these horrible barrel bombs and helicopters that are dropping them, and a humanitarian zone where some of these refugees could could locate rather than just overwhelming the surrounding countries. So have no doubt that Russia is a major player and a major sponsor of Iranian and the 5,000 Hezbollah that are in the fight. So I think that's one area where we could curb Russian behavior and at the same time curb Iranian behavior, which is also very dangerous.
Okay, let me go to further issues. We are in Wroclaw, a city that has been a part of Germany until 1945, and after that is a part of Poland. First communist-dominated Poland, then independent Poland, and it's a very important and special place to discuss European-American relations. We see Europe in transition. The European Union is, to put it mildly, in crisis. We worry about its future. How do you see European affairs from the other side of Atlantic? There is this ambitious plan of building a transatlantic economic area that is probably a chance to revive Europe as well. Do you see any chances that the European idea is somehow in crisis and that may affect negatively the relations to the United States? Senator Murphy.
Well, these last round of European elections are very concerning. Not just the number of Eurosceptics that were elected to the parliament, but the rise of these nationalists and often racist local parties who have gained seats. But at the same time, the very fact that Europe survived the Euro crisis speaks to its strength, speaks to the enduring idea of Europe. And there have been moments of time during the history of Europe in which you have had, largely due to economic disruptions, less popular support for the concept, and hopefully this is a moment of temporary watering down of support for Europe. But TTIP is a really important piece of the puzzle. I frankly sit here as a member of the Senate who has never voted for a trade agreement. I think I've had 3 trade agreements to vote on when I was a House member. Didn't vote for any of them, but I'm a champion of the U.S.-Europe free trade agreement. Well, because first of all, some of the underlying disparities in environmental rules and labor costs are not part of this agreement. Europe is not going to come in and undercut U.S. labor upon the signature of this agreement. And it's an incredibly important geopolitical agreement as well. This isn't just about marrying 2 economies. This is about trying to make sure that it's the United States and Europe that are creating standards for everything from food safety to product safety, rather than allowing for the Chinese and others to force the world to a race to the bottom. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to get this deal done, and hopefully it does buttress the European economy and then also buttress support for Europe.
So it's more a political project, like the euro currency was first of all a political project, or is it an economical project?
No, I think it is still first and foremost an economic project, and to the extent that it fails, it will be because it is very difficult to marry together the non-tariff barriers that exist between our 2 countries, but it has substantial political benefits, and the economic peril that many of us saw in trade agreements being signed with emerging nations are just simply not evidenced in this kind of agreement.
Bipartisan support for trade agreement with Europe?
I believe that I've been in favor of every free trade agreement, and I think there's been great success, whether you look at the Korean, or you look at Panama, you look at Colombia, look at literally every one. And my greatest example is the North American Free Trade Agreement. Look at what it's done for the economies of all 3 countries. Right now, there are choke points on our Arizona border with Sonora of goods and services moving back and forth. The Mexican economy is really starting to grow and strengthen, and any economist, I believe, would say that this free trade agreement between our 3 countries has been a major factor in the really economic benefits that it has had with all 3 countries. There are some problems with it, and will probably always be problems with it. I wouldn't want to talk to you about Mexican trucking, but I know that there is always reasons not to be for a trade agreement. And many times it is the other side that, for example, we all know one of the biggest problems with an agreement with the Europeans will be agriculture, because of the protectionism that is practiced in these small, particularly smaller European countries, of their agricultural products.
To put it honestly, Poland would have some objections to that.
Exactly. And so what I would hope is that we could overcome those specific special interests, which are very vocal and very powerful, and in democracies they have to be listened to. But I would hope that we would have the ability to overcome them, because I know of no example in recent years where free trade agreements didn't do anything but help the economies, and I can cite a million cases where protectionism had a very devastating effect. Most people, most economists look back in history and view the protectionism as one of the many causes for the Great Depression.
And I'd just add, just the one danger about this agreement is because it's going to be so complex, the risk is that negotiators are just going to set aside certain titles because they're too difficult to overcome the challenges, whether it be on agriculture or intellectual property, data privacy, financial services. And you could get an agreement in the end which just simply doesn't live up to the expectations that were set when this was rolled out initially. I'm not in the negotiating room, so I can't give specific advice, but my worry is that we are going to just decide that some of these things are too tough, keep them on the outside, and we'll get an agreement in the end that won't be as big and as bold and as helpful to our economies as we hoped.
We only have 5 minutes, Senators, so one final question to you both. I have started with historical anniversary, the 70th anniversary of the landing of Allies in Normandy, but we have in June this year, we also have 100th anniversary of the First World War. And seen from America, apart from the Ukrainian crisis, do you see any seeds of another major global conflict? I mainly point to China, to Far East. Are there any signs that a storm might be coming, and we mustn't be sleepwalkers who let the world go to war again? Senator McCain. Okay.
Okay. Frankly, I'm very worried about the possible confrontation in the South China Sea. In the last week or so, there was a Vietnamese fishing boat that was sunk by the Chinese. They're doing the usual provocative things, flying up next to our aircraft, trying to establish an air defense zone, just things that are some of it needlessly provocative, but sort of flexing their muscles in a way that could lead not to a war, but certainly some kind of conflict. I also worry about the Korean Peninsula. This young man that has now taken over increases the degree of unpredictability of North Korean behavior dramatically. Anybody who has his girlfriend shot by firing squad has got to be a very, well, anyway, so I worry more about Asia, frankly, right now than I worry around the world. And of course, we've got this horrendous problems now going on in parts of Africa, but those are conflicts that can be manageable. But this China issue, remember that I think it was 1978, the Chinese and the Vietnamese had a very spirited little battle up on the Chinese-Vietnam border, and the Vietnamese gave the Chinese a bit of a bloody nose. They were pretty battle-hardened people. So I am deeply concerned about that. I am deeply concerned about whether the Chinese believe, because of the Syria decision, which I think was a seminal moment in the 21st century when the president said he was going to attack and didn't, that they feel somehow that we are weaker than actually we are. I just want to emphasize finally, if I could, we are still, in the United States of America, with our allies, is still the strongest alliance in the history of the world. It's not a matter of weakness on the part of our alliance and the United States of America. It is a question about fortitude. It's a question about consistency. It's a question about reliability. And those things those areas we've got to do a lot of work on, in my view.
Senator Murphy, any signs of a coming storm?
Well, I think John has very accurately described what are a number
The
of
landscape.
the landscape, a number of tense situations. All I would add to it is that when you talk about what is the real catastrophic risk to the globe that could move beyond these localized conflicts, it is perhaps the proliferation of nuclear weapons technology.
And for that to combat, you need Russia.
So you need that is one of the examples of why you need Russia, and we have been distracted from talking about these negotiations with Iran that are happening right now. Not great news out of the last 30 days with respect to an agreement coming, but while we are trying to deal with these more localized conflicts, we should remember that the one way that we lose control of the globe very quickly is by a nuclear weapon exploding somewhere around the world. If we're sort of getting to the wrap-up point, I just, Senator McCain and I, disagree on tactics, but both of us represent this idea that in whatever way you do it, with military, diplomatic, economic support, that the United States is indispensable, and the alliance is absolutely indispensable. And the reason why I think we've tried to be in Europe representing both parties as frequently as we have been is because there is this strain of isolationism that is creeping into the consciousness of the United States. You're seeing it not just in the United States Senate, but you're also seeing it in some public opinion polls as well. And we've got to remind our constituents that if the United States walks off the world stage, there's no one to replace us. If this alliance crumbles, there is no alliance that can come close to matching it, and that's the main message that we hope to be able to send.
Senator Murphy, Senator McCain, thank you very much. And we keep fingers crossed for the new president of Ukraine. You will be members of the U.S. delegation for his inauguration. Have a nice trip.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.